Bessie Dunlop, the Witch of Dalry, deals with a very dark episode in Scottish and European history, and a topic much in the news recently. There's now a campaign for an official pardon for the victims of witchcraft persecution, and just recently the Scottish Parliament accepted a petition for an official pardon to be issued and a national monument to be erected in memory of the victims. Now, while I'm a bit sceptical about historic pardons or apologies, I do think a national monument is long overdue, and many communities really should have some kind of memorial monument or work of art to remember the many evils committed in their community, especially against women. And one of these evils happened right here, around Lynn Glen, near the old village of Lynn in the parish of Dalry, Ayrshire. For Bessie Dunlop probably grew up and lived in an old clachan just across the burn in amongst the trees down below me here. A few years ago I was involved in a campaign started by a group of Dalry women to have a work of art erected on the new Dalry bypass in memory of Bessie Dunlop. Now, while they didn't get funding for the bypass work of art, they did get some funding to erect more information boards about local history, including one here about Bessie Dunlop, very close to the old village of Lynn where Bessie lived. There is also now a pavement plaque in the centre of the town and a poetry poster at Dalry railway station, which I wrote a few verses for. And just recently, a new housing complex has been named Bessie Dunlop Court in the centre of Dalry. Bessie Dunlop, Witch of Dalry, is a 3-act play, though it can be done in 2, about an actual witchcraft trial of 1576, based on information from the records of the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh, and published in Robert Pitcairn's Criminal Trials of Scotland, 1829. The original version of the play, written by myself and my then colleague Martin Clark, who tragically died in 1983, was for a school drama production in 1977. The play is mainly written in Scots, though there is a mixture of Scots and English in it. I rewrote it about 10 years later for an EIS drama competition, which it actually won. And then I rewrote it again for Hodgart and Stoughton, who published it as a school text in 1995, but now sadly out of print. A few years ago, my colleagues in the ASLS Education Committee suggested we should republish it, and last year I revised it yet again and managed to slim it down by about a quarter. We've now produced an e-book version of the revised play, which I hope will soon be downloadable from our website, and we also plan to have this version available in print before the end of next year, and hopefully there will also soon be an audiobook version produced by Barry Robertson of Grey Hill Productions. Before talking about the actual play, I'd like to say a bit more about the wider historical context, and after that I'm going to talk about the language, style and form of the play, as well as the challenges and opportunities in producing it and using it in English or drama class, or in other subjects such as history, music and art, as I think it's an ideal topic for an interdisciplinary project. Bessie Dunlop was one of the thousands, probably somewhere in the region of 2,000, burned for witchcraft in our country, but unlike many others, her case was recorded in great detail. One of the earliest and most extraordinary cases on record is how Robert Cairn described it in his criminal trials in Scotland. Yet Scottish witch hunts were only a small part of a much greater mania, which periodically erupted like a recurring deadly virus across most of Europe, mainly between the late 15th and the late 17th centuries. It was possibly initiated by paranoid papal authorities faced with growing dissent and protest, but Protestant reformers eventually became just as obsessed by witches as any Inquisition. Across Europe, witch hysteria, including mass burnings, were rampant, with hundreds, including children, sometimes being burned at a time, especially in Germany, France, Italy and Spain. Estimates vary considerably, but probably at least 100,000 were burnt or executed, though it could have been much more, as records have not always survived or were maybe not even kept in some places at all. The witch mania may have arrived later in Scotland than the rest of Europe, as did the Reformation. But shortly after our Reformation of 1560, the Scottish Parliament, following the example of England and other European countries, passed statutes against witchcraft, as the Reformed Kirk sought to stamp out the pagan customs and traditions they saw as being rooted in a dark, devil-worshipping past. Before this time, there were very few cases of witchcraft persecution per se in Scotland, but in the decade or so after these anti-witch laws, cases started to increase, and the more the Kirk warned of the evils of witchcraft, the more the mania seemed to spread. Bessie Dunlop was one of the earlier victims of these laws, but one of the most striking things about her case is that she was nae lonely old carlin or weird outsider feared by her community, but was very much a key figure in her community. She was a young wife and mother, but in one key respect she was very different from her neighbours. She was a skilly wife, a healer, whose skills ranged from midwifery to veterinary practice, using traditional folk medicine and no doubt some charms and superstitions along the way. Thus Bessie must have been a very important and highly valued figure in her community. So why was this much sought after Dalry healer thought to be such a threat, who was important enough to be dragged all the way to Edinburgh and to be tried at the High Court of Justiciary in November 1576, and her case recorded in great detail? The answer might seem obvious, but it's really quite complex and grimly ironic, and caused by factors both national and local. Something of the political climate of the period is sketched in during the opening scenes of the play. A period of dramatic change, fear and turmoil, and political conflict, with powerful nobles and the Kirk fighting for control of the country. And clearly, by having a traditional female healer from a small village taken all the way to the High Court in Edinburgh, the authorities wanted to make an example of someone like Bessie, as a public warning that all those practising the old folk beliefs and customs were agents of the devil. This ancient pagan culture was in fact something that both Catholic and Protestant authorities greatly feared, as traditional healers had a power over women's lives which the Church could not control, and in striking at this they were striking at the very heart of what they feared most: female knowledge, skills and wisdom, which a repressive male hierarchy increasingly feared and saw as satanic. As elsewhere in Europe, the misogynistic fears and paranoia of male authorities played a very large part in lighting the flames of the witch mania. At least 80% of those burned as witches were women, but we should also note that many of their accusers were also women, no doubt often driven by fear, spite, hate or greed, as in the famous Paisley witch trials of the late 17th century, which had many things in common with the Salem witch trials which Arthur Miller famously wrote about in The Crucible. However, in Bessie's case, most of her accusers were men, though she was probably let down by both men and women, including the very people she had once helped, something that's a key feature in the play. Familiars are a recurring element in witch trials, and Bessie's confession records that her knowledge came from her familiar spirit, Tamrid, who was carrying a white wand, possibly an old druid symbol. A man who was apparently a very close friend of the Queen of Elfhame and the elf wichts, or fairy folk, who attempted to entice Bessie away from her man and her wains. As shown in the play, her confession would have been obtained as a result of some fiendishly cruel techniques and instruments of torture, and would have been no more reliable than the evidence produced by the Spanish Inquisition, as in this old drawing, or by any brutal totalitarian regime in more recent times. Her interrogators would have been expert at producing evidence which sounded credible, no matter how fantastic, as Bessie's certainly was. Yet, even allowing for this, there's still something of a mystery about Tamrid, which continues to intrigue centuries later. Was he simply a figment of her interrogators' warped minds, or maybe of Bessie's tortured mind? Or did he actually exist? Possibly an old hermit or gangrel buddy who did not die after all at the Battle of Pinkie. Robert Pitcairn described Bessie's case as one of the most extraordinary, partly because of its great detail about the supernatural, especially regarding Bessie's familiar spirit, Tom or Tamrid, supposedly killed at the Battle of Pinkie, 1547. During his lifetime, Tam had been Baron Officer to the Laird of Blair at Blair Castle here, Dalry. And in fact, Lady Blair had sought Bessie's help in recovering some stolen property, while Bessie's confession also referred to the nearby Laird of Auchenskich as riding with the fairy folk. Bessie confessed that she first met Tamrid here at Monk Castle, a residence that once belonged to the monks of Kilwinning Abbey. In my revised version of the play, I tried to retain a sense of mystery or ambiguity about Tam's identity, including the possibility that, in a sense, he might still have been alive, if only in Bessie's imagination. And I think this possibly reflects my own uncertainty or ambivalence about Tam's identity. But whether he was still alive or not, he is intended as a sort of spiritual presence in the play, an alternative spiritual presence to the dark hellfire sermons of the minister which begin each act of the play. At the same time, I try to highlight the contrast between a devil-obsessed religion and the natural goodness of the healer who used the powers of nature that were all around her, and whose life exemplified the very Christian qualities that the Church was supposed to cherish. Yet, ironically, it was not because of her gifts as a healer that she landed in trouble with the authorities. In a small, close-knit society, Bessie's skills were sought by rich and poor alike. But as time passed and her fame spread, especially in the aftermath of an epidemic, she seems to have been accredited with powers that went beyond the natural, and people sought her help for all sorts of things, especially her apparent ability to find lost or stolen goods, or to foretell the future, things that were often thought to be within the power of a wise woman or spaewife. However, as Sir Walter Scott remarked in his Letters on Demonology and Witchcraft, 1831, a book drawing heavily on Pitcairn's criminal trials, Bessie Dunlop's confession of a wise woman seems to have flourished indifferent well, till it drew the evil eye of the law upon her. Although local gentry, including Lady Blair, had sought Bessie's help on numerous occasions, it wasn't until she made enemies among her social superiors that she landed in trouble, especially after she seems to have stumbled across a case of corruption involving the local sheriff officer, one Jamie Dougal, who had her charged with sorcery, and she was questioned by no less a person than the Archbishop of Glasgow, who initially could find no fault in her. Yet the sheriff officer and other important men in the community persisted with their accusations of sorcery, clearly seeking to silence someone who had caused them trouble. And it was not long before the Kirk authorities almost certainly used these accusations for their own ends. Even Bessie's plea for an assize of her neighbours seems to have backfired on her, as she was disowned and betrayed by some of the very people she had helped. Yet, in spite of all this, Bessie still shines through her confession as an innocent and very fallible witch, and above all, there's not one single piece of evidence that she ever brought harm to anyone. Ironically, for a wise woman, she was also perhaps a victim of her own naivety in trusting people, as well as a victim of her own success in healing and helping others. But she was also probably a victim of vile and vindictive people, as well as a victim of the wider moral sickness of her society. At the start of the play, we see Bessie and her family suffering from a physical illness, the land ill, possibly typhus, for which she is able to find a cure. But at the end of the play, we see her suffering from a sickness from which a cure is not to be found, as she becomes a scapegoat for the problems of a hysterical and devil-obsessed culture. Thus, I hope Bessie Dunlop will be seen not simply as a historical documentary, but as a play that says something about human behaviour which is not without relevance to our own troubled times, especially a world where witch hunts, denunciations and victim-seeking have acquired a whole new lease of life via the cesspit of social media. Although I've departed little from the main facts of the confession, I've tried to get behind the recorded evidence to explain how I think Bessie might have become the Witch of Dalry, and to show how her trial and confession perverted the truth. My main aim was not to unearth the true facts of the case, whatever those were, as these will never be known, but to create a drama about good and evil, and to show how a good person became a scapegoat. Thus, poetic licence is of course more important than strict historical accuracy in bringing Bessie's tragic tale to life. To highlight my interpretation, I've taken dramatic licence, firstly by adding a few characters not mentioned in the confession, such as two local rascals and ne'er-do-wells, Elkie and Walkie, who are hopefully more than just comic relief, or with Bessie's sister-in-law, one Maggie Jack, wife to a John Jack mentioned in the confession, probably a brother to Andra Jack, Bessie's spouse, who is only mentioned as suffering from the land ill at the start, and is then strangely absent from the confession. However, I've given her husband Andrew Jack an important role in bringing trouble to Bessie's door, though in the end he's a conflicted man, feeling guilt and remorse, but still afraid for himself as much as for his wife. I've also departed from the bare facts of the confession by selecting, omitting and sequencing events in order to give the story more structure and shape, though like the confession, the play is still quite episodic in structure, with many of the scenes linked by narration. The intention was to suggest a panoramic view of Bessie's story, showing the many different characters and events that supposedly made up the catalogue of her crimes, but in fact testify to her innocence and goodness. In sharp contrast to the chronicling of events and the detached factual narration, the play contains several stock elements of popular Scottish comedy, which may at first seem strange in a play about witch persecution. In the first act of the play, these familiar comic elements are used to suggest an essentially reassuring world where life's problems can usually be laughed off. Thus, a certain pattern of expectations is built up, but the anticipated pattern soon starts to fall apart, as in Act 1, Scene 11, which wavers between farce and tragedy, or in the urban scenes at the start of Act 2, which begin comically, but end darkly and menacingly. We therefore gradually move into an uncomfortable world of fear, cruelty and victimisation, quite the opposite of what we are earlier led to expect. Likewise, the folk songs, 6 in total, using a mixture of traditional and original tunes, also reflect this change, progressing from humorous convivial ballads to songs of a very different nature as we journey into a grim and dark world, such as the ironic Good Neighbours song, set to the tune of Anna Lach, the Breton melody normally used for the twa chord bass. Some of these contrasts are also hopefully expressed via the language of the play, mainly the contrast between formal English and colloquial Scots. But within these two there are further contrasts, archaic English from the King James Bible, Some of the narration or the court proceedings, which mix formal Scots and English, while there are also different varieties of Scots, from the old legal Scots of the court scenes, parts of the confession, or the pulpit Scots of the minister, and the more archaic Scots of old Tam, to the more modern streetwise language of Bessie's neighbours or some of the rascals and villains. There are hopefully important dramatic reasons for these linguistic contrasts, which also highlight, I think, the advantages of being bilingual in Scots and English. For anyone thinking about a production, the episodic nature of the play clearly presents some challenges but also some opportunities. At times the action moves so quickly between scenes that the use of stage sets or authentic costumes are out of the question, because the transition from one scene to another, often via narration, has to be carried out swiftly, or the flow of the drama is lost. So narration by actors from the previous scene or those taking part in the next scene should help to maintain the flow, so that narration and dialogue are integrated as closely as possible. Although the play has about 50 named parts, many of them only minor parts, it can be easily adapted for a variable number of actors. A large cast has obvious attractions for a school drama production, but it's equally within the scope of a smaller cast if actors double up or play several parts simply via a change of hat or cloak or whatever. The only limitation is that Bessie should probably not take other parts, except maybe some narration, and likewise Tam should probably not take other parts until at least after his last scene. The revised version of the play, like the original Hodgart edition, also contains teaching notes, a glossary, suggestions for classroom activities, questions for discussion or writing. In other words, just about everything you need to use the play in the classroom or drama studio. However, one thing you probably shouldn't do. Gonna no make the wens read it round the class, or you'll kill it stain deed. At least that's my experience. By all means, read bits to them, or ask colleagues, or drama students, or able kids in the class with dramatic flair to record or read some bits for you. But also, of course, use a variety of group activities and tasks, group readings and performances of extracts. Listen to the audiobook version when it comes out, hopefully early next year. Hopefully, other groups will develop their own ideas about production and presentation to suit their own needs and the needs of their own children. I only hope they enjoy working in the text as much as I did with the late Martin Clark, and a memorable cast of very enthusiastic and very talented pupils, as well as a team of very supportive colleagues in Garrick Academy, Kilbirnie in 1977.